Hello, welcome to the Economic Circle. This is Dr. Alexander Moseley, founder of the Economic Circle, online digital magazine as well, which is available through Apple apps and Google Play. I'm going through an A to Z of economics, various concepts, and today is going to be capitalism. Now, what is capitalism and what is it not? Now, for many people, capitalism is defined as an exploitative system in which the rich run the world and the poor are slaves to the rich. The odds are stacked against the working classes of the world and the landless from ever improving their lot, except through revolution. It is a culture as much as a political philosophy, an elitist system that allows the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. Well, this is the Marxist theory of capitalism. It's a particular political philosophy and its definition of what capitalism is. Wherever there is poverty, socialists of all hues demand that the capitalist system be overthrown and rejected en masse so that the people, the majority of whom in their eyes are downtrodden and oppressed, may be given power and control over their own lives. This is a particular political philosophy. Now, Marx defined capitalism as also the final stage in his view of history. This is a historical view, a theory of history of the world. Now, reaching back through time, Marx claimed that peoples have always been divided into classes. Well, especially after the agricultural revolution, which created distinction between those with land and those without. In early societies, he argued, there were many classes. Gradually, though, the number of classes dwindled and would continue to converge onto fewer and fewer classes. So in the 18th century, there were three classes in his mind, at least in his description of England, so it's again particular to a specific country here. There were landowners and merchants, called the bourgeois, and the peasants. In the 19th century, he argued that there were now only two: the capitalists, who owned the means of production, and workers, who owned nothing. Workers would therefore have to sell their labour to the capitalists in order to feed their families. Capitalists would have every incentive to keep wages low because they took the profits from the value that the workers created. Hence the Marxist term wage slavery. You have to work for a living. Inevitably, Marx argued, there would be a social revolution. The capitalists would take more and more, but the workers would have more and more children, somehow, and eventually, by sheer force of numbers, they would rise up and overthrow the bosses and create a classless system. Out would go property rights, money and markets. They would all be abolished in a classless society, which would then flourish somehow or other because no one would be oppressing anyone else. So for Marxists and many students who are subtly influenced by the Marxist view through humanities and some parts of the social sciences, capitalism is something that is inherently exploitative and also something that will inevitably be overthrown or needs to be overthrown, which encourages the activists in society, the rioters, etc., and which is also inhumane and beastly to a large group of people. Again, that was a Marxist view. There is a non-Marxist view. Now, capital to the economist is basically a term implying the means by which we improve productivity. Initially, that means the tools by which we ameliorate the physical toil of feeding, clothing and sheltering ourselves. So using spades instead of our hands, using diggers instead of spades, so it's less back-breaking work. As economies progress, we've noticed, it also comes to mean the monetary input, the monetary capital that's put into a business, the startup capital as it's often called, to get it started. That's all. From an economic point of view, capital therefore just simply removes the pain and toil of work. It also improves the productivity of labour. You can't dig a field or a ditch or a hole with your hands for too long, or it can take you a long time to do it, compared to if you start using some basic implements. Now, in Neolithic history, that would have been shoulder blades of animals, stones, bones, etc. Then with the Bronze Age and later the Iron Age, it was implements, and then later with the Industrial Age, it was steam-powered, and then diesel and petrol-powered machines that can dig a hole and do the work of what would have taken 1,000 man-hours in just a few hours. Quite incredible, really. That's what capital is. So from an economic perspective, capital is a neutral term. Incidentally, while we just touch on Marx, his communist friend Friedrich Engels was financially free from his family's capitalist company, and could in turn support Karl, his friend, in his ravings against Victorian life and capitalism. Ironic that, isn't it? He was also of Jewish descent, but hated Jews. He was quite anti-Semitic in his writings. Strange chap. Anyway, nonetheless, Marx also appreciated how physical capital could improve the lot of the poor, because he realised these machines were making life a bit easier for people. He wasn't that stupid. He just thought that you could destroy the system that created the capital and keep the product. Perhaps he never read the story of The Goose and the Golden Egg by Aesop. So the word at the moment is either an ideological infused political theory, coming from Marxism as a description of human society, or a term used to describe the tools and implements that we use in production. The former is political, and it has an agenda to overthrow, through revolution, the market system, money and property. The other merely describes the application of tools and machines to production. Now, Marx's predictions turned out to be very wrong on many accounts. Firstly, the poor got richer in capitalist economies, oh dear, and did so quicker in societies that had more machines and tools than those that didn't, which makes sense because machines add to physical productivity. Economic growth has always been better in countries that encourage trade rather than controls and aggressive war. So those that move towards trade and towards what we generally call capitalism improved the lot of the poor. The poor got richer. How extraordinary. It's quite common sense when you do economics, though. Secondly, the only big socialist revolutions were in politically authoritarian states such as China and Russia, and they substituted one form of oppression for another. And this has had the Marxists jumping up and down ever since, saying, well, that wasn't really communism, that wasn't really Marxism. Well, whenever a country heads towards Marxism, it retreats at some point. Lenin had to do his famous 180-degree turn and accept the need for money and markets in his new economic plan, because people were starving. The bread just didn't suddenly appear on the shelves, and he knew that if the people were starving in sufficient numbers, they'd overthrow his revolution. Now, I'm not going to go into the analysis and strengths or weaknesses of Marxism, because it can be quite intricate, and there's some good bits in there we can all look at and understand and go, interesting point there, Mr. Marx. Nonetheless, the word is thrown about by socialists and critics of capitalism who give their particular ideological twist to the word. So accordingly, it's been used as an instrument of criticism of Wall Street, so Occupy Wall Street people, G7 meetings, whenever they meet there seem to be protesters, high unemployment, high inflation, aggressive war, patriarchy, the existence of wealth, the existence of poverty, any form of inequality. The Marxists are jumping up and down saying that's part of the capitalist system. It's very, very broad strokes, like painting history and society with broad strokes is not all true, and there's a lot of generalizations and a lot of sloppy usage of language there. It's often the case when you enter politics anyway, isn't it? Now, for many supporters of the free market, the word capitalism describes the economic system that they support, i.e. free market capitalism. They contrast their view of the word with socialists. For the free market supporters, capitalism means free markets, the free exchange of labour and goods and services, a monetary economy, a propertied economy, so people have property rights, the rule of law and of peace, and a minimal government. But critics often confuse their target by lumping non-free market institutions and policies into the same basket and calling it, usually with a lot of derision, capitalist. These include mercantilist economics or corporatist theory or central banking. Now, none of these are actually supported by proper free market economists. Interesting, though. Capitalism qua free market economics is not mercantilism. So what's mercantilism? Mercantilism is an economic theory that came out in the 17th to 18th century, and it argued that the world's wealth is fixed, that everything's scarce, and that one person or a nation's gains is necessarily at the cost of another's. So one person's gain must be at the cost of another. Now, economics rejected mercantilism from Adam Smith onwards. Trade, the economists pointed out, logically is necessarily mutually beneficial. Otherwise, we wouldn't engage in it. Now, mercantilists also believe that that money is wealth. Hence, if you've got more money as a nation, you're doing well. And this sparked off a lot of wars for gold, and also in the 19th and particularly the 20th century, printing money to say, well, we've got more money floating around the economy, we must be richer. Now, economists deride those theories and say, don't be stupid, you've just created inflation. Nobody's poorer because you've just devalued your currency. So unsurprisingly, mercantilism is often connected to what's called an inflationist doctrine, and this is often pursued by central banks. I'll be touching on those a couple of times as well. Now, a lot of people may go back and say, hang on, you've just said that trade is mutually beneficial. What if I was in a trade and I had to trade my money for some bread, otherwise I'd starve? Well, it's your choice. You prefer to give up the money, which, funnily enough, you can't eat, as King Midas found out when he wanted everything turned into gold, in return for something that you do want. And we all have choices, we make choices, and when our ability to buy things is limited, then we can learn how to improve our lot. And rightly so, critics point out and say, yes, but some people are thwarted and hindered from buying more because they can't prosper in their economy. And fully agree. And what is often the case there is you'll find that there's government intervention and barriers stopping people from competing against the middle classes and the rich by undercutting them in the labour market or in the goods and services markets or in the professions, because there are privileged elites, guilds, professional unions as well as unions, that thwart labour market competition and other things. That's another story then, right? Corporatism. Capitalism qua the free market economics is not corporatism. Now, corporatism is a modern spin-off of mercantilism. It's the political theory that states that states should ally, that governments should ally, or cannot help but ally, join forces with large corporate interests to direct the economy and economic production. Now, corporatism is an elitist philosophy in which the strongest companies are said to be the biggest and therefore the best, and therefore in turn they attract the interests of the state or government for both plundering their large profits, we'll have a bit of that, and for macroeconomic policy directives. We will give you these licenses to run a mobile phone company if you employ X amount of ethnic minorities, women, or whatever the political fashion is at the time. Now, the banking system, again, I'll touch on that again, is inherently corporatist and mercantilist in that the state uses the banks to create more money out of thin air, a theory based on the fallacy that money creates wealth. This is why we have credit crunches and credit booms. Credit is basically something created out of thin air by a fractional reserve banking system. I'll touch on that now. Central banking, the fractional reserve banking that's supported by the government and their central banks, is not part of capitalism. The fraud committed by banks operating on fractional reserves cannot be sustained either in the marketplace or by objective jurisprudence. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, if you take your money to a bank, if you take £10 in or $10, whatever, €10, the bank can lend out upwards of £90 or more. This is quite incredible. We can't do this. If I take a car to a car lot and say, right, here's my car to sell, they can't advertise on the internet that they've got 10 cars. They've just got one on the lot, that's all. But banks are allowed to do this by privilege, by government privilege, which is the grossest intervention in the economy. It's been going on for 400 years and it creates the boom-bust cycles that we all suffer. And there's a lot of people who haven't got their head around this, especially professional economists, and say they just accept the system and go with it because that's their baseline. And say, well, you can't really challenge the banking system. It exists. Well, it only exists because of privilege and laws protecting the right of banks to commit basic fraud. That's not capitalism, right? Objective jurisprudence means when the law is not allied so much with the state that it protects the state interests. When the law is protecting the state's interests or on the people's interests and the interests of people who own property, whatever level, then the law is statist. It's not actually looking after property and people. It's looking after the state. And often in Western societies, the two get muddled. And yeah, a lot of law does protect people, but there are some laws protecting the state. Now, central bank is also an offshoot of mercantilism, the notion that more money means more wealth. It's also connected with the corporatist agenda of governments and big companies. Large companies, for example, have better access to the banking system's credit supplies, the money that's created out of thin air, and therefore they can use it to exploit market position and keep smaller companies at bay. This is why the big pharmaceutical companies, the big agricultural companies, the big car companies, the big supermarkets can have a huge share. Yes, they're driving economies of scale, and there's nothing wrong in that. But when they do it through the credit system, a credit system that small companies can't access as well, then that's giving them an unfair advantage in the marketplace. So again, that's not capitalism. This is a corporatist, mercantilist agenda. So what is capitalism? Well, it is a funny term. Marxists say that it's an exploitative, class-based system. Supporters say that it's the free market. Now, neutrally, it just means the application of tools and machines to improve productivity. That's the basic neutral term economists would use. But it all gets mixed up, especially by socialists who see the world in terms of clashing interests, us versus them, and whose purpose is often to cloud the waters so people end up a little muddle-headed and lean towards socialism because it seems to make sense. When you actually study socialism in depth, it starts to fall apart. But let's not worry about the details about how bread will be produced, the early Marxists thought. Lenin was a little bit more pragmatic and retreated on pure Marxist theory and said, we need money in markets because otherwise there's going to be no food and there's going to be riots and rebellion, a coup d'etat, and we'll be out of here very quickly. And this is the history of the Soviet Union from then on, that there was a lot of pragmatism in the system to ensure that there were markets, there were money. Supporters of the free market sometimes call themselves capitalists, but as we're seeing, it's not the best term to use. The word is too infused with Marxist and socialist critique and implication to be of use. Better would be the terms libertarian or even anarchist. A libertarian believes in a minimal government, that the market is the best place for production and consumption to take place, that state intervention is inherently violent and destructive. It creates economic distortions. The state should only use force in the realm of law and order and national defence. Now, an anarchist of the anarcho-libertarian variety goes one step further and argues against the existence of the state. Both agree on the harmony and peaceful voluntary actions of allowing people to do as they see fit and using reason and the market as methods of interaction rather than having recourse to violence and war. Now, political theory does take us into many variants on themes. So another review of capitalism is we often find, there's the free market or laissez-faire capitalism I've just mentioned. There's also welfare capitalism, crony capitalism, corporatism we've just looked at, social democracy, state capitalism. There's all these hosts. Now, it's like asking someone if they smoke. They say, you can either say no, or then they say, well, I'm a social smoker, or yeah, a few a day, a pack a day, or yes. Now, the last four answers are all, yes, I smoke. They just have the rationalisation, well, I only smoke when I have a drink. It's still smoking, you're still a smoker. And it's the same with all other variants of so-called capitalism. As soon as the government is intervening, either by directing people's lives according to political or bureaucratic aims, or disturbing the flow of the market activity with controls and commands, it's no longer capitalism in the free market sense. A preferred term here is statism. Statism is the belief that the state should have a political and economic role in people's lives. Libertarians and anarcho-libertarians argue that the state should keep out of the way of people's choices, whether those choices are about religion, sexuality, dress, health, wealth, prices, production and consumption. There's a continuity there, and there's an inconsistency to say, people should be religiously free, but not free to go into the market and buy and sell whatever they want to. That's a contradiction, it's an inconsistency. Now, so long as an individual or corporation is not harming another person or group, it should be free to trade and exchange as it sees fit. Now, of course, people do intentionally and unintentionally harm each other. For most political philosophers, that is what the law is for. Anarcho-libertarians, who are very anti-state, believe that laws are generated in communities and that is sufficient. People can sort out their own differences using perhaps insurance and arbitration services which can be bought on the market. Libertarians tend to accept the need for a state framework to ensure equal access to justice for all as reflecting objectively held human rights codes. But the role of the state is limited to actual acts of harm and not intervening to prevent harm either in people's domestic lives or in waging anything other than defensive wars. The state, for the libertarians, should uphold people's property rights and not aggress against people's lives, property, or their voluntary decisions with whom they contact and associate with, what sort of opinions they hold on various things. So the next time someone is attacking capitalism, just ask them, what do you mean by capitalism? Do you mean tools and equipment? Do you mean the imposition of violence by some on others? Do you mean mercantilism, in which you believe that the world's wealth is fixed and that states have a duty to fight for a greater share? Or do you mean the corporatist agenda of the large banks supported by a government institution, the central bank, to quell competition and to regulate businesses such that only the large can survive and in turn be directed by the state and oppress competition of small businesses? Or do you mean the voluntary and peaceful interaction of people going about their own affairs, serving their fellow humans through their own talents and productivity, and enjoying the fruits of others as bought voluntarily in the marketplace? And if it is the last, well, what do you have against peace and people choosing their own lives? Now, inevitably, this short review of capitalism is going to be hindered by a lack of detail. I've touched on 3 versions of capitalism: the Marxist view, the neutral economist's view that capital just implies using tools, and the free market capitalist view. There's obviously a lot more to be learned, and that takes us into the role of looking at political philosophy. In an introduction to political philosophy, I outlined the key points for the major political philosophies. Very proud of the book. It's great. It gives a very good, pretty neutral view of socialism, conservatism, environmentalism, anarchism, libertarianism, realism, liberalism, and statism. All the isms you need to know. Each section looks at human nature, society, the state, and international relations. So if you want to know more, check my book out, An Introduction to Political Philosophy. It's available on Amazon and all leading bookstores and sellers. And that will give you much better review and analysis and the ability to evaluate. You've got to make up your own decision about what things are and what things mean. But give you a better idea of analysis and using words with much more precision, because you'll find when you do, you will hear that a lot of people, as Socrates found out when he was wandering around the Greek markets listening to people and asking them, well, do you really know what you're talking about? That you often find a lot of people don't know what they're talking about. Like, it's a capitalist agenda. Well, what do you mean by a capitalist agenda? What are you talking about? You often find out that it's a government agenda. It's a statist agenda. Capitalism is inevitably exploitative. Well, that's a Marxist view of history and society and culture, which economic theory rejects completely and says, no, trade is actually mutually beneficial. We wouldn't engage in it otherwise, right? Capitalism is innately patriarchal. No, not necessarily. More women open up businesses and small businesses, and so do ethnic minorities in a capitalist society than a non-capitalist society, full enough. So, go find out. But what this is about is making sure you know what your terms are, use them precisely, use your definitions well, listen to the waffle that people talk about, and just say, hang on, you're waffling. What are you talking about? What do you mean by this word? Let's put it on the table, see if we can agree what the definition is, and then analyse it and make our own judgments based on it. Okay? See you in another unit. Bye.